They hanged the Apache chief's son, but the rancher risked his life to save. The sun rose slowly over the dry, dusty plains of Arizona, painting the sky in shades of pink and gold. In the distance, the rugged mountains cast long shadows across the desert, and the wind carried the scent of sagebrush and dry earth. Life on the frontier was harsh and unforgiving, and the small town of Red Rock was no exception. Wooden buildings lined the main street, and the sound of horses' hooves and wagon wheels clattering on dirt roads was constant. But that morning, something more serious than the usual bustle filled the air. A sense of tension, heavy and uneasy, hung over the town like a storm cloud ready to burst. Kiowa, the son of the Apache chief, was sitting quietly in the small jail at the edge of town. His hands were rough from a life lived outdoors, his dark eyes steady but alert. He had been accused of a terrible crime, one that many people in Red Rock believed without question. The local merchant, a man named Harris, had been found dead, and some townspeople insisted that Kiowa had been the one responsible. Whether it was true or not hardly mattered. In those days, justice in small towns could be swift, and rumor often became fact in the minds of those who were angry or scared. Kiowa tried to stay calm. He had grown up listening to his father's stories about the dangers of settlers who misunderstood his people, but he also knew that not all white men were enemies. Still, the walls of the jail felt tight and confining, and every sound outside, the creak of a wagon, the distant bark of a dog, made him flinch. He wondered how much time he had left. The sheriff had done his best to keep the peace, but a mob was forming, and the idea of being taken by angry men made his stomach twist with fear. Meanwhile, John Callahan, a rancher known throughout the region for his honesty and fairness, watched the town from his porch. He was a large man with broad shoulders and hands hardened from years of working the land. His ranch sat a few miles from Red Rock, but he often came into town for supplies or to settle disputes between settlers and the local Apache. He had always believed in fairness, and he had earned the respect of both sides because of it. That morning, John could see trouble brewing in the main street. Groups of men gathered near the sheriff's office, shouting and waving their arms. Some carried ropes, and others gripped their rifles, as if preparing for war. He recognized a few faces, neighbors he had shared meals with, men he had trusted. Yet their eyes were filled with fear and anger, a combination that made them dangerous. John knew that once a mob decided on something, reason often left the room entirely. John's thoughts went to Kiowa. He had met the young Apache boy several times, delivering supplies to the tribe and sometimes helping settle small disagreements peacefully. Kiowa had always been polite and respectful, though proud and strong-willed like his father. John could not believe the boy had committed such a violent act, but he also understood that in the eyes of the townspeople, doubt mattered little. They wanted someone to blame, someone to punish, and Kiowa had become that person. The rancher felt a deep sense of responsibility. He had seen enough violence in his life to know how quickly it could spiral out of control. He knew that if Kiowa were hanged without a proper trial, the consequences would extend far beyond the walls of Red Rock. The Apache tribe would be outraged, and more blood would be spilled in retaliation. Families could be destroyed, lives lost, and the fragile peace that had existed for years might vanish forever. John realized that doing nothing was not an option, even if it meant risking his own life. As the morning wore on, the mob grew louder. They pounded on the jailhouse doors, shouting for the sheriff to hand over Kiowa. The sheriff, a weary man named Tom Harris, tried to reason with them. He explained that Kiowa was a guest of the law and deserved a fair hearing, but the crowd would not listen. Their fear had turned into anger, and their anger into a dangerous kind of certainty. One by one, the townspeople began to voice their intentions. They would not wait for the law to decide. They had come prepared to hang Kiwa right then and there, to send a message that no crime would go unpunished. Inside the jail, Kiwa pressed his back against the cold stone wall. He could hear the men shouting outside, their voices growing more threatening by the minute. His mind raced. He thought of his father, Chief Nantan, and the lessons he had been taught about courage, patience, and the importance of protecting one's people. But he was young, and fear made even the bravest heart tremble. He wished there was anyone who could help him, someone who understood that he was innocent or, at the very least, did not deserve to die without a trial. John Callahan did not hesitate. He mounted his horse and rode toward the jail, feeling the wind whip his face as he passed the fields and hills he knew so well. He had no plan yet, only a determination to act. When he reached the outskirts of the town, he dismounted and approached the sheriff cautiously. "Tom," he said, lowering his voice, "we need to get him out of here before someone does something they'll regret. There has to be a better way than bloodshed." Sheriff Harris looked at John with a mix of relief and worry. He knew the rancher's reputation for bravery, but he also understood the danger. "John," he said, "if we try to move him now, the mob will tear us apart. They want blood, and they won't stop until they get it." John nodded, his jaw tight. He had expected that. "Then we'll have to be smarter than them. I won't let Kiwa die like this. Not on my watch." He looked back toward the jailhouse. From a distance, he could see Kiwa peeking nervously through the small window, his dark eyes wide with fear and hope. That glance was enough. John knew what he had to do. The town's tension continued to build. By mid-morning, the crowd had doubled in size. Women held their children close while men brandished ropes and sticks. The air was thick with dust, and the smell of sweat, and the sounds of shouting echoed across the plains. Even some of the older settlers, men who had seen countless conflicts and lived through the hardships of frontier life, began to worry that the situation might spiral completely out of control. Inside the jail, Kiwa shifted from one foot to the other. He thought of his family, his tribe, and the stories his father had told him about survival, courage, and the importance of standing firm in the face of danger. But he also knew that courage alone might not be enough. He needed someone to act on his behalf, someone who understood that a single act of violence could change many lives. And in that moment, he felt a small spark of hope when he saw John Callahan approach the sheriff, speaking quietly but firmly. By noon, the sun hung high and hot in the sky, and the mob grew restless. Their impatience was palpable, and the sheriff feared that their rage would turn into action at any moment. He glanced at John, who had moved closer to the jail, surveying the crowd and the surrounding streets. Every minute counted. Every step had to be precise. One wrong move, and it could mean death for Kiwa, or for anyone who tried to help him. John's mind raced as he thought of a plan. He could not rely on brute force. There were too many men, too many eyes watching every move. He would need stealth, courage, and quick thinking. More than that, he would need allies who could be trusted not to falter in the face of danger. He thought of his ranch hands, a few loyal friends who had worked alongside him for years. If he could reach them, perhaps they could help him carry out the impossible, save a boy from a town that had already decided his fate. Kiwa, meanwhile, tried to remain calm. He thought of his father and the tribe's teachings. He remembered the stories of men who had faced impossible odds and survived because of their courage and their allies. He closed his eyes and silently promised himself that he would not give up, that he would hold on until help came, and that he would repay any kindness shown to him with loyalty and respect. As the afternoon sun beat down, the first signs of action began to take shape. John moved quietly along the edge of the street, observing the mob, noting their patterns, their strengths, and their weaknesses. He saw the ropes, the knives, and the anger in their eyes, and he knew the danger was real. But he also saw hesitation in a few faces, doubt, fear, a hint of conscience. That gave him hope. If he could find a way to turn that doubt into action, perhaps he could create a path to save Kiwa. The stage was set. The town teetered on the edge of disaster, and the lives of many hung in the balance. Kiwa sat in the jail, his heart pounding, aware that time was running out. John Callahan, the rancher who had earned the respect of both settlers and Apache, prepared himself for the most dangerous act of his life. And the desert, wide and silent, seemed to hold its breath, waiting to see what would happen next. In that moment, it became clear to everyone involved that this was not just a story about a crime or a punishment. It was a story about courage, about justice, and about the choices that define a man. And for Kiwa, John, and the people of Red Rock, the events of that day would change everything forever. The tension in Red Rock was thicker than the summer heat that pressed down on the dusty streets. Word of Kiwa's arrest had spread quickly, and by mid-morning the crowd outside the jail was larger and angrier than anyone could have expected. Men shouted, some with faces red from the sun, others from anger, their voices bouncing off the wooden buildings and carrying across the plaza. Children peered from doorways, frightened, while mothers tried to calm them, whispering that everything would be all right. But inside the small jail, Kiwa felt anything but safe. Each shout, each stomp of a boot on the wooden planks made his heart pound faster. Sheriff Tom Harris stood in front of the jail, trying to keep the mob at bay, but it was almost impossible. He was one man, and the mob had grown to dozens, perhaps even more than 100. Some held ropes, others carried sticks and lanterns. The anger in their eyes was frightening. They had made up their minds, and reason had little power against their determination. The sheriff knew that if he tried to stop them with force, blood would almost certainly be spilled. And yet, he could not simply hand Kiwa over. Meanwhile, John Callahan paced at the edge of the street, just out of reach of the mob's notice. His eyes scanned the crowd carefully, noting the way people moved, the whispers passing from one to another, and the small gestures that betrayed both fear and courage. He had a plan in mind, but it was dangerous, almost reckless. The thought of the boy trapped inside that jail, with death so close, pressed heavily on him. He clenched his fists and breathed deeply, trying to steady his nerves. There was no turning back now. If he did nothing, Kiwa would surely die, and the consequences would ripple across the plains, reaching both settlers and the Apache tribe. That was a price John was unwilling to pay. Kiwa, sitting on the cold wooden bench inside the jail, tried to focus on something else to keep his mind steady. He thought of the mountains that surrounded the valley, of the wind rustling through the trees, and of his father, Chief Nantan, who had taught him lessons about patience and courage. He knew he could not fight the mob by himself. He was strong in body and spirit, but one against many was a battle no young man could win. Still, he refused to give up hope. The sight of John earlier speaking quietly to the sheriff had sparked a small flame of belief that someone would come to help him, and in that moment, that tiny hope became his anchor. As the morning turned into afternoon, the mob's impatience grew. The shouting turned into chanting, and the noise became almost unbearable. Some of the men stepped closer to the jailhouse, threatening the sheriff with angry gestures. Sheriff Harris tried again to speak calmly, urging patience, reminding them that the law existed for a reason. But the crowd would not listen. They wanted swift justice, and no words could stop them. Harris looked to John, silently pleading for help, knowing that without intervention, there would be no control over what was about to happen. John knew that action was urgent. He mounted his horse and rode toward the edge of town where a few of his trusted ranch hands waited. These men had worked with him for years and were loyal, brave, and careful. As John approached, he called quietly to them, explaining the danger and the plan that was forming in his mind. They would need to be fast, clever, and precise. One misstep could mean death, not just for Kiowa, but for everyone involved. And yet, all of them understood the stakes immediately. The boy's life depended on their courage and skill. While John and his allies prepared, Kiowa felt the walls of the jail closing in around him. Every shout outside, every movement of the mob made him tense. He could hear the faint creaking of the jail door as the men outside tested it, hoping to break it down. His hands trembled slightly, not from weakness, but from the fear that filled the room. Still, he tried to stay calm, repeating to himself the words his father had spoken long ago. Courage is not the absence of fear, but the choice to act despite it. He clutched the small wooden cross his mother had given him, a reminder that he was not alone. Back on the outskirts of town, John and his men moved carefully. They approached the jail from the side, keeping out of sight of the main street. They scouted for guards and possible escape routes, noting every barrel, crate, and shadow that could provide cover. John whispered instructions to his team, ensuring that each man knew his role. One would distract the crowd, another would help Kiowa escape, while the rest would secure the path to safety. Every step required patience, timing, and trust. The plan was risky, but there was no other option. Inside the jail, Kiowa sensed movement. He saw shadows shifting outside the small window. Could it be help? His heart leapt with cautious hope. He pressed himself closer to the wall, ready to move the moment the opportunity came. He had no idea what John was planning, but he trusted him. The rancher had always been fair and brave, someone who had earned respect from both settlers and Apache alike. And now, in Kiowa's darkest hour, he was the boy's only hope. The mob outside grew restless. Some began to call for action, shouting that the law was too slow and that justice required immediate attention. Their voices were harsh, filled with anger and fear, and the sheriff knew that any delay could result in violence. He looked toward John and his team, silently urging them to act quickly. Time was running out. Then John gave the signal. One of the men in his group lit a small fire in a barrel at the far end of the street, drawing the attention of part of the mob. Shouts erupted as people ran toward the noise, some shouting warnings, others curious. The distraction was brief but effective. John and the rest of the team slipped toward the jail, moving quickly but quietly. Every step felt like it stretched the seconds into eternity. And Kiowa, sensing the moment, pressed himself against the door, ready to follow instructions. Inside the jail, the door creaked as one of John's men worked the lock. Kiowa held his breath, listening to every sound. When the lock finally gave way, he moved quickly, slipping into the waiting arms of the rancher's team. His heart raced, but relief flooded through him. He was free, at least for now. But the danger was far from over. The mob would soon realize he was gone, and the chase would begin. John knew that their next steps had to be swift and precise. As they moved through the narrow back streets of Red Rock, the tension was unbearable. The sun blazed overhead, and the sound of horses' hooves and shouting from the distracted mob was never far behind. Kiowa's legs ached from fear and adrenaline, but he kept running, guided by John and the others. Every alleyway, every turn was a chance for escape or disaster. They relied on John's knowledge of the terrain, his experience in the wilderness, and the trust that Kiwa placed in him. By late afternoon, they had moved outside the town, reaching the open plains where the heat pressed down on them like a heavy blanket. The mob was still shouting in the distance, but for the first time in hours, Kiwa could feel a sense of relief. He was alive. He was free. And though danger still surrounded them, hope had returned. John and his men knew they were not out of danger yet, but they had taken the first critical step towards saving Kiwa from a fate he did not deserve. As they rested briefly behind a cluster of rocks, Kiwa looked at John with gratitude and wonder. "Thank you," he said quietly, his voice trembling. I don't know what I would have done without you." John nodded, his eyes scanning the horizon. "We're not safe yet," he said firmly. "The town won't stop looking for you. But we'll get you to safety, one step at a time." Kiwa nodded, understanding the seriousness of their situation. The escape had been successful, but the journey ahead was uncertain. There were still dangers on the plains, from both people and the harsh land itself. Every decision, every step, could mean the difference between safety and disaster. And yet, in that moment, something unspoken passed between the two of them. A bond of trust, courage, and shared purpose that would guide them through the trials to come. The sun began to sink low in the sky, casting long shadows across the desert. The colors of the plains shifted from gold to deep orange, and the wind whispered through the sagebrush. Kiwa felt exhaustion settle in, but also a strange kind of peace. He had survived the first, most dangerous part of the day, and though the road ahead would be difficult, he knew he was not alone. With John Callahan by his side, there was a chance, just a chance, that he could survive, not just the mob in Red Rock, but the larger challenges that awaited him in the days to come. The desert stretched endlessly before them, golden in the late afternoon sun, but to Kiwa and John, it felt like an ocean with no shore. Every step forward carried both hope and danger. The plains were open and unforgiving, and while the escape from Red Rock had been successful, they were far from safe. Behind them, the distant shouts of the mob still echoed faintly, carried by the wind, a constant reminder that their pursuers were relentless. John knew that if they slowed down, hesitation would cost them dearly. Kiwa walked beside John, his legs stiff and his muscles sore from the hours of running and hiding. He tried to keep his breathing steady, though fear and exhaustion made it difficult. He had been trapped, almost handed over to death, and though he was free, the memory of the jail and the angry faces of the townspeople clung to him. He glanced at John, whose strong frame seemed calm and unshakable, and drew strength from the rancher's confidence. John's presence was like a shield, a reminder that he was not alone and that someone truly cared about his life. John led the way, keeping to the higher ground where they could see any approaching danger. The sun burned on their backs, and the desert wind carried sand that stung their skin and made every movement slightly more difficult. Yet the rancher pressed forward without hesitation, constantly scanning the horizon for any sign of trouble. He had grown up in this land, knew its hills and valleys, and understood the paths that offered the best chances of safety. He had relied on his knowledge many times before, but never for a task as urgent or dangerous as this. The group moved carefully, using small washes and rocky ridges to stay hidden. John had sent 2 of his men ahead to scout for any movement in the distance. Their job was to make sure no one had caught up and to signal if danger approached. Kiwa watched the men disappear into the distance, And though the thought of being alone in the desert scared him, he forced himself to remain silent and still. Every sound they made could give away their position. Every step had to be deliberate. Hours passed, and the sun began to dip lower in the sky, painting the desert with deep oranges and purples. Kiwa's mind wandered as they moved. He thought of his father, Chief Nantan, and the lessons he had learned about bravery, patience, and the strength of the spirit. He remembered the stories his father had told him, tales of the Apache people surviving against impossible odds, relying not only on strength, but on intelligence and trust. Now, those lessons mattered more than ever. Kiwa realized that courage alone was not enough. He needed to trust John, follow his lead, and be ready to act when the time came. The desert was quiet except for the sound of their footsteps and the occasional cry of a hawk in the distance. It was a silence that felt alive, as if the land itself watched them. John spoke only when necessary, giving clear instructions and reminders. "Stay close," he said quietly, "and don't make any sudden movements. If they catch sight of us, we run fast and stay low." "Understood?" Kiwa nodded, understanding fully. There was no room for mistakes. The mob was not just angry, they were dangerous, and desperation made people reckless. As evening fell, they stopped near a small cluster of rocks to rest and catch their breath. The men spread out slightly, keeping watch in all directions. Kiwa drank from a water skin, feeling the cool liquid revive his parched throat. He wanted to ask questions about where they were going, how far to safety, but he knew that words could be dangerous. Silence was safer, and so he simply listened to the sounds of the desert, the whisper of the wind, the rustle of small animals, the distant call of a coyote. Even in the stillness, he could feel the tension in the air, the awareness that danger was never far behind. John crouched beside him, examining the horizon. "We're not safe yet," he said softly. "The mob is persistent, and they'll look for every trail we leave behind. We need to keep moving tonight, while the darkness hides us." He handed Kiwa a small piece of jerky, and the boy accepted it gratefully. Food was scarce, and the energy it provided would help them continue. "Rest a little," John added, "but keep your senses sharp. Every sound could be important." Night fell, and the desert transformed under the light of the moon. Shadows stretched across the land, making rocks and dips in the ground look like obstacles that weren't really there. The cool night air was a relief from the heat of the day, but it also brought new dangers: wild animals, treacherous footing, and the possibility of being seen by searchers from the town. John led the group carefully, using the cover of darkness to their advantage. He whispered instructions, pointing out safe paths and warning of potential hazards. The journey was slow but steady. Kiwa learned quickly to follow John's movements, to place his feet where the rancher did, and to pause when John paused. Every lesson he remembered from his father about observing, listening, and thinking ahead became essential. He noticed details he had never seen before: the way the wind shifted, carrying sound from far away, the faint trails left by other travelers, the subtle differences in the sand that hinted at obstacles ahead. In this harsh desert, survival depended on observation as much as speed. Hours passed, and the first hint of dawn began to appear in the east. The darkness was fading, and with it, some of their protection. John knew that moving in daylight would be far more dangerous, but they were not far from a small canyon that could provide temporary cover. He motioned for the group to stop and crouched low behind a rock, scanning the horizon. "We move quickly to the canyon," he whispered. "It will give us shelter, and we can rest during the day without being seen." Kiwa nodded again, trusting John completely. The canyon was rough and rocky, but it provided the cover they needed. The men spread out slightly as they entered, keeping watch in all directions. Kewa finally allowed himself to sit and lean against a rock, exhaustion catching up with him. He could hear John and the others speaking in low tones, discussing their next moves, and sharing observations about the land. Even in this brief rest, Kewa felt safer than he had since the morning. The canyon was a temporary haven, a pause in a dangerous journey. As the morning sun rose higher, the temperature climbed, and the desert became even more unforgiving. Kewa and John moved carefully through the canyon, stopping whenever the sun was high to avoid leaving shadows that could be seen from a distance. They drank from their limited water supply and ate small rations of food, conserving energy for the long journey ahead. Kewa realized that survival required patience, not just courage, and he followed John's lead without question. The day was long and the landscape seemed endless. Kewa's muscles ached, his lips were dry, and his eyes strained from the bright sun. Yet he pressed on, driven by the knowledge that safety was just beyond the horizon if they could only continue. John encouraged him, offering brief words of reassurance and instruction. "One step at a time," he said. "Every step brings us closer to safety. Keep your focus and we'll make it." By late afternoon, they had made significant progress. The land was less open, dotted with small trees and larger rocks that could provide cover. The wind had shifted, carrying sound differently, and John used this to their advantage, leading them on a path that was less likely to be noticed by anyone following. Kewa felt a growing sense of hope, even as he remained aware of the dangers. They were not safe yet, but survival felt possible for the first time since the morning of his arrest. As the sun began to sink toward the horizon, painting the desert in warm oranges and purples, Kewa finally allowed himself a brief smile. They had survived the first day after the escape, navigated the desert, and avoided detection. He looked at John, whose expression was calm but determined, and felt a deep sense of gratitude. Without the rancher's knowledge, courage, and quick thinking, he would not be alive. And now, he realized, their journey was about more than escape. It was about trust, bravery, and the will to survive against impossible odds. Night fell again, and the desert cooled, bringing relief but also reminding them of the constant dangers of the land. Kewa lay beneath the stars for the first time in hours, feeling the desert's quiet strength surround him. He thought of his father, of the tribe, and of the lessons he had learned about patience and courage. And he knew that, with John Callahan by his side, there was a chance, however small, that he would survive the trials still ahead. The journey was far from over, but hope had returned, and with it, the determination to continue. The desert was quiet at dawn, the soft light spreading over the plains like a gentle promise. Kewa and John had finally reached the outskirts of the Apache settlement, a place hidden among rocky hills and clusters of trees, far enough from Red Rock that the shouts of the mob were only a memory. The boy's legs ached, and his body was stiff from the long journey, but a sense of relief washed over him. For the first time in 2 days, he could breathe without fear pressing down on his chest. Yet even in this moment of safety, he knew the world beyond these hills still held challenges. Escape was only the first step. Rebuilding trust, healing fear, and finding peace would take longer. As they entered the camp, the Apache people gathered quietly, watching with a mixture of concern and caution. John led Kewa forward, explaining to the elders what had happened and how he had helped the boy escape. Chief Nantan, Kewa's father, stepped forward, his face a mixture of relief, pride, and deep concern. His eyes met John's, and for a moment, no words were necessary. The chief understood the danger John had faced in helping his son, and the courage it had required. John, in turn, felt the weight of that acknowledgement and knew that the trust between their two communities had grown stronger because of this act. Kiwa approached his father slowly, overwhelmed with emotion. He knelt briefly, a sign of respect, before embracing Chief Nantan. Tears ran down his face as he spoke quietly, thanking his father for the lessons of courage and patience, lessons that had guided him even in the darkest moments. Chief Nantan's hands rested gently on his son's shoulders. "You were brave," he said softly, "and your courage was matched by those who risked their lives for what is right. Today, we see that honor and justice can guide even the most dangerous times." John remained nearby, watching the reunion with quiet humility. He had never sought praise or recognition, but seeing the relief on the faces of the Apache people, knowing that Kiwa was safe, filled him with a deep sense of satisfaction. The danger of the past days weighed heavily, but in that moment, it was replaced by a calm pride. Actions, not words, had saved a life and prevented a cycle of violence that could have caused endless suffering. John realized that bravery often came with quiet deeds, unseen by most but remembered forever by those whose lives were touched. In Red Rock, the aftermath of Kiwa's escape slowly became known. The townspeople were shocked that the boy had evaded them, that their mob had failed. Some felt anger at being outwitted, while others began to question the actions they had been ready to take in their fear and anger. Sheriff Tom Harris, too, faced criticism and whispers about his inability to control the crowd, yet he also carried relief, knowing that no innocent life had been lost. The event sparked conversations among the settlers, forcing them to consider the dangers of acting without understanding and the importance of justice guided by fairness rather than prejudice. Back in the Apache camp, Kiwa spent time recovering, his body regaining strength and his mind processing all that had happened. He realized that survival required more than courage alone. It required trust, the willingness to accept help, and the ability to keep hope alive even when danger seemed overwhelming. He spoke with his father about what had occurred, sharing his experience of fear, escape, and the kindness shown by John and his team. Chief Nantan listened carefully, nodding with a solemn understanding. "Bravery is not the absence of fear," he reminded his son, "but the choice to act with honor despite it. You have learned that lesson well." John stayed in the area for several days, helping Kiwa regain strength and assisting the Apache people in practical ways, repairing fences, checking supplies, and offering guidance where his knowledge of the land could help. During that time, bonds formed between him and the community. They shared stories, meals, and laughter, recognizing the mutual respect that had grown from this experience. John observed the resilience of the Apache people, their deep connection to the land, and the strength of family and tradition. In turn, he shared his own experiences of life on the frontier, building understanding between two worlds that often misunderstood each other. The events also brought changes to Red Rock. The townspeople could not forget what had happened, and slowly discussions about justice, fairness, and prejudice began to take root. Some settlers reflected on their willingness to act in anger, considering how fear had clouded judgment. Sheriff Harris worked to reestablish trust in the law, reminding the community that violence and haste could destroy lives unnecessarily. Over time, the story of Kiwa's escape became a lesson, a tale of courage and cleverness that reminded people of the value of patience, understanding, and human life. Kiwa, for his part, grew stronger and wiser from the experience. He realized that his life could have ended because of fear and misunderstanding, but through courage, trust, and the help of a brave friend, he had survived. The experience taught him the value of allies, the importance of thinking carefully in moments of danger, and the power of hope. He shared these lessons with younger members of the tribe, ensuring that the knowledge of what had occurred and the values that guided survival would continue to be remembered. John eventually returned to his ranch, carrying with him a quiet sense of pride and a deeper understanding of the people he had chosen to help. Life on the frontier continued, filled with daily struggles, challenges, and opportunities for courage. Yet John knew that the events surrounding Kiwa's escape had changed him, leaving an indelible mark. He had risked his life not for fame or reward, but because it was the right thing to do. And in doing so, he had strengthened bonds of trust, demonstrated the power of compassion, and proven that one person's courage could save another's life. As the years passed, the story of Kiwa and John Callahan became a quiet legend in the region. People spoke of the rancher who risked everything to save the Apache chief's son, a tale that reminded settlers and tribes alike of the importance of honor, bravery, and understanding. The memory of fear, anger, and tension faded, replaced by lessons that encouraged dialogue and respect between communities that had once been divided. And though the desert remained as harsh and unforgiving as ever, it also became a symbol of survival, courage, and the enduring power of human kindness. In reflecting on what had occurred, Kiwa often thought of the moments of fear in the jail, the long trek across the plains, and the cleverness and courage John had shown. He realized that life was fragile, yet precious, and that trust and cooperation could overcome even the most dangerous challenges. He carried these lessons into adulthood, leading his people with wisdom and care, teaching that justice should be guided by honor and courage, not fear and anger. And every time he looked toward the hills that marked the edge of Red Rock, he remembered the rancher who had risked everything to save a life that mattered. John, too, remembered the events clearly. He knew the desert would always hold dangers, that human fear and anger could erupt in violent ways, and that courage often meant acting when others hesitated. But he also knew the profound satisfaction that comes from doing what is right, even when the risk is great. The bond he had formed with Kiwa and the Apache people remained strong, a reminder that the choices we make in moments of crisis define who we are. And so life continued on the frontier, shaped by bravery, trust, and the knowledge that one act of courage could ripple far beyond its moment, touching lives in ways that endure forever. The sun set over the desert, casting long shadows across the plains. Kiwa stood with his father, looking out at the horizon, feeling the warmth of the land and the strength of his people. John rode past on his way back to his ranch, tipping his hat in a quiet gesture of friendship and respect. In that simple moment, a story of fear, courage, and justice came to a close, leaving behind lessons that would echo for generations. Life on the frontier would continue, challenging and unpredictable, but the memory of this journey would serve as a reminder: courage and compassion, even in the face of danger, can change the course of a life, and sometimes the lives of many.